essentially a schematic for an infinite energy machine. See, if you take a malleable metal like copper and then make it in a coil around a magnet, whenever you push the magnet through, it causes the electrons inside of the copper to shift. Whenever electrons shift, that creates electricity. So if we've got one coil and one magnet and we do that, we get a bit of electricity. Cool. But what happens if we take 1,000 of them? We all line them up directly in an order, to which whenever the magnet is moved, that causes an electron exchange, which therefore causes power. What if we put them all on a giant sort of lever that gently rocks back and forth, and the way that we power that is we just put a few of these copper magnet combinations at the bottom to power the mechanism that makes all the other magnets move. Say we build enough of these to fill up an entire warehouse, and yada yada, you could follow it to the point that you could power a whole city through perpetual energy. While this has worked in closed experiments, the whole idea is we can't do it because big oil and evil electricity companies and all that good stuff. In 2009, 28-year-old Shania Asom suffered an asthma attack while she was in Memphis, Tennessee. She went to the doctor, got a steroids injection, and went home, and everything seemed fine until she started to itch all over her body. She soon started developing scabs all over her skin, her legs began to darken, and the doctors couldn't figure out what the condition was, although they expected staph or some other common skin infection. However, despite all of their efforts, they couldn't make the infection go away, and after traveling to a dermatologist, it was determined that Shania had a since unknown disease. For a reason that to this day no one can explain, every hair follicle on her skin is producing about 12 times the amount of skin that it's supposed to. This causes extreme callousing everywhere on her body that hair is supposed to be, creating an effect where it seems as if her hair follicles are growing skin so dense it's similar to a nail. And to this day, doctors have absolutely no clue what it is. They're continuing doing tests, trying to figure out the causation, but as far as they know, her hair follicles are just overproducing skin, and they're none the wiser to it. Appendix Monkey Tail is saying that perhaps our appendix operates in the same way our monkey tail would. It's believed that our tailbone is a product of what is now called a vestigial organ, or in other words, an organ that we needed at some point in the past that we outgrew in the modern day, meaning that our tailbone used to be where a tail was attached, but now that we don't have a tail, the tailbone's kind of useless. It's now been determined that perhaps the appendix was used as a sort of digestive reboot, as a means of completely flushing the body system if it were to be too backed up by plant matter or bones or something that would be otherwise undigestible. But since we haven't eaten those things in so many years, we've slowly lost the use of it. So again, much like our tailbone, it's something that's just there because we used to need it and now we don't, and it kind of just takes up space. This is what I get for doing the disturbing movie Iceberg. Like, there's going to be one of these horrible things in every video I do from this point on, so cool. Alright, so you see the word, it's there, right? So according to this theory, that is used as a rite of passage in several secret societies. The reason for this is that an unholy amount of people report to the emergency room every year with this, because they use the concrete to perform that action and then they get stuck. But it's at such an alarming rate that people believe cults are responsible, or doing it as some horrible satanic rite of passage or whatever. It's just trying to explain why people are the way that they are. The Dog Suicide Bridge is in reference to the Overton Bridge in Milton, Scotland. Ever since the 1960s, an absurd amount of dogs have leaped to their death from this bridge. Keep in mind, this isn't a small bridge at all. It's 50 feet off the ground, and it doesn't really make sense for dogs, an animal that seemingly never commits suicide, to just jump off at such a given rate. It's so bad that dogs walking beneath the bridge will climb to the top just to jump off, and dogs that have jumped, survived, will limp their way back up to the top just to jump again. The primary theory that scientists have had around the area is that perhaps there are several minks nesting, and them marking their scent makes the dogs go for it, which sure would make sense, but that doesn't explain why dogs that are already down there around where the mink would be would climb to the top just to jump, or especially why a dog would jump, climb back up, and jump again. Especially since, according to legend, this has been going on since the 1960s. Many believe this to be a demonic or spiritual site in which spirits or the supernatural overwhelms these dogs to commit suicide from the bridge. I should also mention that in research for this, I found a story of in 1994, a man killed his newborn son on the bridge and then attempted to kill himself. While the stories go that dogs have been doing this on the bridge since the 1960s, the first official reported cases of dogs jerking off began shortly thereafter. Just food for thought. Pro-war Buddhism is the fact that throughout history there have been different cases of Buddhists becoming pro-war or pro-defense in order to protect themselves. Buddhists are traditionally known as very hardcore pacifists all the way into the face of death, or at least the traditional Buddhist monks are. While it's well known that in South Vietnam around 1963, whenever there was heavy Buddhist oppression occurring in the area, Buddhists began to make very open protests and shut down roadways in response to the killing of Buddhists that was happening under the Vietnamese regime. What is lesser known is some of the more modern instances. I also want to emphasize I'm not saying anything about overarching religion or like specific ins and outs of religious beliefs in certain areas or Thailand. I am again describing a very complex situation in a couple minutes, so again, bear with me. In Thailand in 2004, several Buddhist monks were attacked and killed by Muslim attackers. In response to this, several of these Buddhist monks began to arm themselves. Now, traditionally in Buddhist beliefs, this is completely shunned. However, there were interesting ways that they worked around it. For example, as you can imagine, a Buddhist monk cannot be a member of the military. However, the Thai military began these suspended enlistment programs in which you could kind of be part of the military, not really part of the military. So these sort of in the military people became traditional monks in order to protect other monks that existed in the Thai region. One of the stories I was reading was an interviewer who was speaking with one of these monks in 2006, and they asked the monk if it was true that some of the monks were arming themselves, and the monk lifted up his robe, pulled out a handgun, put it back, and they just continued the interview. It's a very interesting example of how far even the most peaceful people will go if they're pushed, or as the saying says, even a worm will turn. The Akashic Records put forward by psychic Edgar Cayce is a means of better understanding psychicness itself. According to Cayce, whenever he would conduct psychic links with people, he would for one connect to them, but the second connection would be to something that he called the Book of Life. He describes this as a sort of cloud storage that exists all around us and everywhere at the same time. It contains the memories, thoughts, actions, and beliefs of every human that has ever existed. According to Cayce, we are all connected through this super link, and possible memories or glimpses and even dreams that we have at any given point can either be from another human who's experienced them or a combination of all the different brain patterns mixing with ours at the same time. Cloud farming, or cloud seeding, is exactly what it says. Throughout history, there have been cases of governments purposefully farming clouds in order to get whatever agricultural benefit they want. This is done by planes depositing chemicals into the air that encourage precipitation. The most common is like potassium iodes or even dry ice being used in order to begin to form ice crystals and therefore create snow. However, historically, sometimes things like silver iodes have been used, which aren't good for people to, like breathe in or drink or something like that. See, the thing with it is, this isn't necessarily creating rain clouds, it's just a way to encourage rain cloud formation. So if you know that rain clouds are about to form, you can deposit them into an area in order to speed it up and move the direction the cloud will travel. This has led to countries like China having their neighbors accuse them of literally stealing the rain so that China can have better agriculture and crops than they do. Limbic brain is often used as an excuse of why some people do the things that they do. See, whenever we're comfortable, happy, and accepted in a situation, we operate using our prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain most commonly associated with reason and complex thought patterns. However, sitting just below and behind our prefrontal cortex is something that's often called the limbic brain. This is our system that derives on emotion and instinct. Whenever we're operating off of it, we're much more manic and reactive and emotional whenever we're put into a situation. This isn't only the fight or flight response that you may be familiar with, but also things like heartbreak or loneliness and how we kind of rely on our emotional state rather than our logical state. Obviously, this isn't a state of mind that you want to keep up for any amount of time. So putting it short term, whenever you're happy, part of a group, and content, you are thinking logically, and whenever you're alone, depressed, and unsure of your purpose in life, you're thinking emotionally. This is kind of obvious, but where it matters is in its sociology implications. Part of the reason that people may do evil things is simply because they do not want to be reverted to their limbic brain and have to interact on their own. Or in other words, people don't want to be alone, so they will do things that may be morally reprehensible in order to fit in. Emergency broadcast neuralizers is referencing the sounds that are heard at the beginning of an emergency broadcast. See, the concept of a neuralizer is that it homes in on specific brain waves or syncs out brain waves in order to manipulate memory or thought patterns or something like that. The thought is emergency broadcasts are used to either forcefully calm you, alter your memory, or change your perception of events around you. Basically, emergency broadcast systems are used as a means of forced complacency on the population. This is another one of those misinfo ones. However, it's at least a fun misinfo one. There is an entire chart, huge theory to this thing, which I will link in the description, about how The Simpsons is actually real footage taken through a wormhole of another United States government that radioactively hurt the people, and blah, 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 weird hokey pokey science stuff. However, this is an example of misinfo because this is put on the list, as I've mentioned before, and with the parrot as a means of subverting wandering eyes. Because once again, think about it this way. If there's stuff down here that matters, and if there's stuff down here that could be serious that you don't want other people to see, whenever they look at a list that says something along the lines of The Simpsons is real footage, they go, oh, okay, it's just more weird hoax, lizard alien people stuff. So, as mentioned before, this is a parrot. Roman metaphysics takes heavy inspiration from Greek metaphysics, or what is essentially the study of what's real. See, ancient Greeks philosophers were constantly looking for ways to better describe life or to describe the world around us. Metaphysics was an attempt to define what is real or what can be determined in the real world. There were two primary competing philosophies within ancient Greek, one of which being that we must always rely on our senses to determine what's real in a world that's ever changing, or that we must always rely on logical reasoning because our senses can lie to us in this changing world. Plato best described it as this: say that we have a chair, and we all understand what a chair means. Well, if we exclusively use our senses to tell us what a chair is, and we only know what one kind of chair looks like, does that mean a chair can only be what we think it should look like, or can there exist different forms of chairs? On the other side, we can't always just be logical or use reasoning to determine it, because say we do something arbitrary like, oh well, a chair has 4 legs and you can sit on it, that means a cow, a horse, and big dogs are also just forms of chairs. This led Plato and later Aristotle to develop the idea that they refer to as hylomorphism. This is the core concept of the idea that there are forms and matter, and that despite changes, there must always be some constant, even if we're not aware of it. Put most simply, it's a roundabout way of saying that a chair can look like a ton of different things, but we know what a chair is, so that's still a chair, which means it's got to have something in common with every other chair that exists, even if they don't look anything alike. A lot of this metaphysics gets into ideas of how it applies to people. For example, Aristotle said that despite he did not exist beforehand, his form and matter was still created into the creature that is now known as Aristotle. Therefore, there has to be through lines, even if unseen, that connect whatever present self exists to the past and future self. What's so interesting is that despite being written in ancient Greek times and then adapted into Roman times, these are basically the modern principles that we use for theoretical physics. That things have to have constants in order to be understood as they apply to a greater world that we know not of, and how these connections can be manipulated. It's so interesting that all the way back then they were unintentionally, or possibly intentionally, laying the groundwork for the greater universe as we see it today. Prison Earth refers to the idea that we exist on an earthly prison. Think of it this way. Throughout all of human history, there has always been a need and a struggle for something. On the grand scale, it's been order, resources, agriculture, or in the modern day of power and wealth, all the way down to the individual, fighting for personal recognition or even just the ability to breathe and take in food. Now, of course, this is all we know of life to be, and it's hard to imagine a life without it, but perhaps this constant need for something implies that we are supposed to exist in a realm of pure ecstasy, or a realm of pure not need. Thrive, that's the word, a place where we thrive instead of survive, yeah. So that's like the philosophy side of it. Here's the creepy moon part. A lot of these theories say that the moon itself was constructed. Examples being, geological samples have said that the moon is older than the Earth. Craters on the moon have been identified as depressions. In other words, they have been sucked in from within the moon. The prevailing theory behind this is that the moon itself is hollow. hollow moon theory, or at least whatever structure is inside of it is allowing this extra space to cave in, there is a completely abnormal amount of titanium on the surface of the moon, and several seismic activities have been reported on the surface of the moon despite nothing causing them. In other words, whatever's doing it had to come from the inside, leading to the belief that many of this prison Earth theory have, that the moon itself was made as an observatory to watch us from, and is essentially acting as our giant warden, making sure that we don't get too far from the Earth. And then you could tie this in and say that with the Mars bunker theory, that was our prison before, and then we got sent to this one. And if we ever try to go past the realm of the moon, we'll get shot down or something like that. And that's what the 9 minutes of the missing Apollo 11 mission was, and it's all connected. Or just go with the theory that the moon is a giant space monster egg that's going to break out and kill us all. I like that one. Inorganic beings implies the existence of non-carbon life, but not only non-carbon, non-physical. See, this is hard for us to even imagine because everything of our understanding of life exists in the physical or things that interact with the physical, like ghosts or spirits. Think about something that doesn't even exist on the same plane of dimension of us, but does take up the same space. If these things are entirely spiritual or aura-based creatures, then perhaps what they feed on, in the same way we feed on other organic materials, is auras and spirituality itself. You can run a lot of cool theories with this and say that perhaps haunted locations are just these things' feeding ground. And whenever people go there and experience fear, that energy they're giving off through fear provides food for these creatures. You can go even further with that and say perhaps UFO sightings or monster sightings and things like that are mind alterations made on people from these non-organic creatures as a means of maintaining energy. So don't worry, it's not a monster under your bed. It's just a super fourth dimensional spiritual being that is creating fear within your body in order to harvest your energy. So, nothing to be afraid of. Sleep deprivation lifestyle refers to what happens if someone undergoes long-term sleep deprivation. As we know, without sleep for long periods of time, people begin to lose cognitive and social functions. However, there are theories that if someone goes a really long time on the amount of sleep deprivation, they will lose functions such as consciousness. There's been a lot of cool theories proposed with this one, that that's what allows the id of our brain to take over, or our more primal self, or perhaps certain spirits or things that exist within this world can inhabit our bodies if we allow that consciousness to be so worn away. I talked about the Russian sleep experiment in like tier 1 or 2 of this iceberg, so imagine this as the practical version to carry out that. Dinosaurs helped build the pyramids. Whenever I saw the conspiracy theory iceberg and wanted to do a video on it, this is what I was hoping for. A lot less depression, a lot more dinosaur. Discovered a few kilometers from the Great Pyramids of Egypt, lesser pyramids have been found that contain papyri that have some interesting transcriptions on them. In these papyri, it talks about giant beasts, or god beasts as they're called, that were used in order to build the pyramids. It says things like they carried the limestone across the rivers and were used to haul the large weighing rocks that were used in order to construct the pyramid. In these transcriptions, whoever wrote them said that they ate the grass of the Nile plains, that their tail was large enough that a swing could kill a whole army, that their neck reached to the clouds, and even contained several inscriptions and images of these supposed creatures. While things like this have always been referenced in, say, Job, that dinosaurs existed much closer to humans than we think, now several Egyptologists, which I didn't know was a thing before researching this, some of them have gotten on board with this and said, yeah, perhaps the pyramids were built with the assistance of dinosaurs, which is the nicest thing I think I've said in this entire iceberg. Anunnaki Puppet Show relates to the Anunnaki, which I mentioned however many tiers ago, which were the supposed alien gods of the Babylonians and the Sumerians. See, the Sumerians, as I mentioned before with things like the Dogon tribe, had very weird things when it came to their religion and beliefs. Like, for example, they had very accurate tracings of our constellations and our solar system. And as mentioned before, they had these idols of beings that they said came from the stars and taught them science and agriculture and things like that. The Babylonians were very similar. As a matter of fact, some believe the Old Testament translations that were mentioned of these Babylonians, whenever they would talk about the angels coming down or God coming down, was actually just a version of these Anunnaki. So much so that people say the Tower of Babel, in which, according to the Bible, God confused their languages, was actually a space station they were building to go to the stars, to which the Anunnaki then confuse their languages. So yeah, the puppet show belief is that the reason the Anunnaki have done all this is simply for entertainment, and that